Greetings, and welcome to another episode of Haunted History with Sherry Brake. That's me. In each episode, we will venture down the not so straight path of the paranormal and into dark history, exploring the oddness of life and death, dark and light, evil and goodness, demon and angel. We'll cover subjects such as folklore and superstitions, hauntings, cryptids, mythology, witchcraft, haunted travel, and dark history, of course. This particular episode focuses on ghosts of the Civil War and the state of West Virginia, in particular, of where I reside. A state that was born of the Civil War in 1863 and a war that occurred on American soil. This was a time where neighbors feared each other, brother fought against brother, and families were ripped apart. The Civil War left behind unforgettable stories of brave soldiers, heartbroken families, violent battles, and a paranormal legacy that continues to fascinate and scare us more than 155 years after the war has ended. Now, for anyone who's ever lived in West Virginia or even traveled through the Mountain State, you can easily see what an ideal place that this would be for ghosts. It's an unending sequence of valleys and hills, of hollers and rivers, with a backdrop of other mountains in the distance. Over all of these mountains and valleys is a wilderness and trees, so that lonesome places exist in almost all sections of the state, even until this very day. Thousands of ghosts could gather nightly on West Virginia's hills or up above the treetops, and a few living souls would even know the difference. Since the beginning of time, people have spoken of ghosts, spirits, unusual happenings that defy explanation. No matter how urbanized or remote a location is, many stories and folklore survive and are handed down for generations to enjoy. The details can change a bit with repeated telling and personalization, but the main body or the essence of the story survives. Back in the frontier days, the early settlers would clear their locations in the woods and they would erect their cabins. The hardy settlers fought off enemies, braved the elements, carving themselves a niche in the wilderness. At night, they gathered around the fireside for friendship, gossip, and safety, while whispering of weird creatures, spooks, and spirits that dwelt in the darkness just outside their cabin clearing. This brings me to my first tale, Droop Mountain Ghosts. Every family in both the North and South were touched by the ravages of war. Nearly 1 out of 3 males were said to perish during the War of Northern Aggression, as some called it. The Battle of Droop Mountain occurred on November 6, 1863. The battle was fought with nearly 4,000 Union forces led by Brigadier General Averill. The South was led by Brigadier General Eccles with approximately 1,500 men. There were many men who fell that day in battle and just as many who dropped weapons and retreated out of sheer terror. It was a Northern victory, but losses were suffered on both sides. The Union had 275 casualties, and the Confederates suffered 119. Some soldiers are in marked graves, while others are scattered and remain lying in unmarked resting areas. It is speculated that Civil War ghosts remain because of jobs left unfinished, or possibly due to their sudden and tragic deaths. Perhaps the battle still rages on in the spirit world. There have been ghostly apparitions spotted at Droop Mountain Battlefield in Pocahontas County, West Virginia. One spirit is dressed in a tattered Civil War uniform and is wearing an old hat while smoking a hand-rolled cigarette. He does not try to communicate with the observer and quickly fades almost as soon as he is spotted. Another Droop Mountain legend gives us a ghostly horse that is dapple gray in coloring. He's been heard and seen on several occasions throughout the park area, often startling those who encounter it. Visitors to the park have heard the horse snorting and experienced the sound of horses' hooves galloping nearby. They turn to see the misty gray horse disappear before their very eyes. John Brown's Ghost. Jefferson County has its share of haunted history. In the historic town of Harpers Ferry, many ghostly sightings have occurred. The most impressive is that of abolitionist John Brown. Brown gained attention when he led small groups of volunteers during the Bleeding Kansas crisis. Unlike most other Northerners who advocated peaceful resistance to the pro-slavery faction, Brown demanded that violent action be taken in response to growing Southern aggression. John Brown believed that he was the instrument of God's wrath in punishing men for the sin of owning slaves. He was determined to seize the 100,000 weapons at the Harpers Ferry arsenal and to utilize the surrounding mountains for guerrilla warfare. It was a perfect setting. Set on his goal and well prepared, Brown began his raid on Sunday evening, October the 16th of 1859. His 21-man Army of Liberation ambushed the armory and took control of several other strategic points. Just 36 hours after the raid had begun, most of his men were killed or wounded, but Brown was still able to capture the armory fire engine house. It was then that United States Marines stormed the engine house building. John Brown was arrested and jailed. In Charlestown, Brown was found guilty of treason and of conspiring with slaves to rebel, as well as multiple counts of murder. He was hanged on December 2nd, 1859. John died in 1859, a few years before the Civil War broke out, but his story continues on as a hero to many and a ghostly sighting to a few. He's said to still walk the streets of Old Harpers Ferry, a tall, stately figure dressed in black with a full beard. Visitors have approached him for a photograph, thinking he's with the Park Service, or maybe just a convincing reenactor of the era. When they look at their photographs later, of course, he's not visible in them. Others say that they have seen him walk towards the fire engine building, only to seemingly vanish into thin air. On another instance in the early 1980s and during a Civil War reenactment weekend, several witnesses saw a reenactor with an amazingly similar appearance to Brown. He was very polite, although coming across as a little bit frightening. He even agreed to be photographed. As before, when the photos were developed, it was very clear that Brown had disappeared. What is it that causes the specter of Mr. Brown to possibly appear? Paranormal researchers agree that an unfinished job on Earth can be the cause of such occurrences. As the old ballad goes, John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave, but his soul still marches on.
John Brown's body lies a mouldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a mouldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a mouldering in the grave. His soul is marching on.
Apparently, Mr. Brown seems undaunted by the grave as he continues to appear in Harpers Ferry, in Charlestown, and on the old Kennedy farm in Maryland. You know, as a researcher, we all know ghosts are said to haunt locations tied to their death and also places important to them while living. John's spirit is no different from thousands of others that I have researched. If the spirit moves you, plan a weekend trip to Harpers Ferry, West Virginia. If you see a slender man with a black dog at his heels, don't ask for directions. He won't be of any help. A Civil War prison lost to time, the Athenaeum in Wheeling, West Virginia. I'd finally found the location where my fourth great grandfather had been held as a prisoner and as a dangerous spy during the American Civil War. I was a bit disappointed, as I expected to find a gloomy and dilapidated building that would speak of its dark history and sordid past as a prison. I was looking for an old prison style building for Confederate soldiers, and all I found was an empty lot. The lot even looked cheerful, which was not what I'd expected. When you hear of a building being used as a prison, your mind conjures up tall stone walls, turrets, bars on the windows. There was no building or even a suggestion of one, much to my dismay. Manicured grounds with flowers planted and a scattering of park benches obscured any hint of what really took place here in 1862. This was how long ago my fourth great grandfather had been held captive, along with many others who were defending their state's rights during the Uncivil War, which divided families, neighbors, and communities. Walter Cool was the wealthiest man in Webster County, Virginia, as recorded by the census in 1860. He was an elected official and was now serving as sheriff for the town of Addison, now Webster Springs, West Virginia. Walter was in his 60s and was in decent shape from farming. He was said to be well respected and had married the daughter of one of the area's pioneers, John Clifton. Hannah and Walter lived off the land, with farming as their main source of income, and they raised a good-sized family, as many families did back in those days. Besides, the more children you had, the more free labor the farm received. When the war between the states broke out in 1861, it appears Walter tried to remain neutral, but other sources suggested he helped run a local militia unit called the Webster Daredevils. Regardless, he was arrested on the Gully Divide in 1862 with several horses that he had no receipt of sale for at the time that the Union troops had found him. He was arrested and convicted as a dangerous rebel. A military trial was held for him, even though he was not an enlisted man, and he was charged and found guilty. Walter was taken to the Athenaeum prison in Wheeling for imprisonment. Well, this brings me to my little trip to Wheeling in search of the old prison. I wanted to see where Walter was kept and perhaps stand and walk the halls where he had been. I'm the type of person who loves genealogy, as many in my family did, and any chance to walk where ancestors have walked really intrigues me. Perhaps it is a feeling of connection with our past that we all yearn for as we age. Regardless, the Athenaeum's history was interesting. It had been the largest building in Wheeling when it was built in 1854 and had housed a theater on the upper floor. When the Civil War broke out, it was converted to a prison to house prisoners for the short term. Individual cells were constructed up on the stage, and the dressing rooms were converted into cells for individual confinement. By mid-1862, large numbers of prisoners began to trickle in. Their stay at the Athenaeum had to be a hard one to endure. The usual method of controlling the prisoners was to attach a ball and chain to one of their legs. After the war, the building burnt to the ground in 1868, and the largest fire Wheeling, West Virginia had ever seen. It took with it all of the dark secrets that a prison of this type harbors. My fourth great-grandfather, Walter Cool, was held here as a prisoner until he was sent to Johnson's Island Confederate Prison, located on Sandusky Bay in Lake Erie in the state of Ohio. It was a pretty day in March when I stood on the ground where he had been a prisoner 153 years before. Even though it was relatively warm, I shivered as I thought of some of the mistreatments that the prisoners had all suffered. I took several photos that day as I walked the park-like area. I wondered how many visitors picnicked here and never knew the dark history of where they were sitting. Then again, I guess it would not make for such a pleasant picnic spot if they did know. The Soldiers Memorial in Beckley, West Virginia. Beckley, West Virginia is a town that is steeped in colorful history. From the first arrival of the native Indians, through the tumultuous years of the Civil War and the booming era of local coal mines, to the present-day city focused on tourism. History is an important part of folklore, and this area lends itself to both subjects. If you park your car and walk around historic downtown Beckley, you'll see many historic homes and quaint business storefronts. Various Civil War monuments and plaques dot the area landscape. When Alfred Beckley founded the town in the 1830s, the local Native American Indians had already moved out of the area or had been persuaded to relocate. All that were left of the Native American Indians were their trails, and as an engineer, Mr. Beckley used them as blueprints for roads, making this town a very popular stop along the new frontier roadway. As the town's population grew, grander buildings were constructed and memorials were built. One of my favorite haunted locations in this town is the Soldier and Sailors Memorial Building. This building opened in 1931 as a memorial to the veterans of World War I. Through the many years since its opening, it has been used as a temporary courthouse, a YMCA, and a library. This building's haunted history dates back to the very day that it opened. During the opening ceremony, a platform at the rear of the speaker stand collapsed and caused 20 people to drop 12 feet into the basement area, with heavy building stones falling among them. The injured included a pastor, a doctor, and a member of the band that was playing. According to a Huntington newspaper article dated November 16th of 1931, 6 people were taken to the local hospital, with 3 of those requiring a stay for treatment. Local legend says that the injured young man, who was a tuba player, survived despite a broken neck injury. The tuba player moved into an apartment in the basement of the building a few years later, and it is there that he reportedly saw an apparition. Unfortunately, the gentleman is said to have died in the building later on, which gives many ghost hunters more foundation from which they can build their case for the paranormal upon. Some paranormal investigators speculate that an untimely or violent death at a location can add to the possibility of paranormal activity. We all know that. But since this man's death, a few people have encountered what they believe to be his ghost. Also reported are disembodied footsteps, untraceable knocking sounds, and whispers captured on audio when no human is speaking. A few reports that are more spectacular mention sightings of ghostly children and a man who walks the balcony area. This ghostly man appears to be middle-aged and wearing clothing typical of the 1930s era. Could this possibly be the man who died in the building? Urban legend and fact tend to blend in this case, but I hope you get a chance to visit the historic downtown area of Beckley, West Virginia. Perhaps even stroll past the Soldiers Memorial on a moonlit night. And if I were you, I'd have my camera ready, just in case. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Haunted History with me, Sherry Brake. If you're interested in my events, programs, ghost tours, international tours, check out my website at hauntedhistory.net. I've been investigating the paranormal and researching all things odd and intriguing for over 30 years. My love for the paranormal has resulted in over 20 books being published in the last 20 years. My goal is to share my story, my insights, and my love of this crazy, dark, twisted, and intriguing subject we call haunted history. As I've said before, ghost stories don't need to be made up. History is frightening enough. Don't you agree? So until we meet again, I'm going to leave you with a quote by George Eliot. Our dead are never dead to us until we have forgotten them.